Good afternoon, dear members of the Academy of Sciences, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the President of the Latvian Academy of Sciences, Professor Ojārs Spārītis, let me welcome you here at the Latvian Academy of Sciences for a truly special event. Today we have the honor to welcome Professor Džona Lenoksa from Oksfordas University to give a public lecture, Hokings and Dawkins, Is God a Delusion? And let me just briefly say a few words about our distinguished guest and the context of this lecture, and also explain you the format, how the lecture and the following questions and answers session will be held. So Professor Džona Lenoksa has a spectacular career in mathematics and is known for his works in the theory of groups. He has been educated at the University of Cambridge, and presently he is Professor of Mathematics at Oksfordas University and Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science, as well as Pastoral Advisor at Green Templeton College, Oxford. And as Professor Džona Lenoksa is one of the distinguished scholars who believe that it's the responsibility of the scientist to engage in topics and inquiry beyond the narrow confines of his own discipline. And recently, Professor Lenoksa has been very active globally, I would say, engaging in public lectures and discussion on the topics of science, theology, and ethics. Professor Lenoksa has written a number of books on these issues and is also giving lectures on theology, science, and religion at Oxford University. And it might be known to also to the public here in Latvia that there are other scientists who are also quite vocal on these issues, usually representing the materialistic worldview, and those of two of those gentlemen, they are also mentioned in the title of today's lecture. Professor Hokings and Professor Dawkins, both from the United Kingdom, have been very active and published a number of books challenging the religious faith and making very broad statements about the reach of science and the relation between science and faith. And so Professor Lenoksa has been debating both Professor Hokings and also Professor Alan Good, who is the father of inflationary cosmology. Those debates have been televised and they have been viewed by millions of people, and we feel very, very pleased and privileged to have Professor Džona Lenoksa gives us the unique opportunity to listen to him and to ask him questions as well. So in a few minutes, less than a minute, I will call John on stage, but before that I'd like to say that the lecture will take approximately 45 minutes, 40 to 50 minutes. After that, we'll have a questions and answers session. There'll be a microphone available, and I will give you word to formulate questions. And I think just right after the lecture, we'll give more explicit discussion. So the question and answer session is also supposed to be around 30, 40 minutes. Okay, I think it's more than enough, and I'm more than pleased to give this stage to Professor Džona Lenoksa. Please welcome.
Labdien! Ladies and gentlemen, members of the Academy, I was very honored to receive the invitation from your president to come and address you today. I consider that a great honor, and I thank you very much for your warm welcome. I am embarrassed because here I am speaking English, and you can all understand English, and I can speak 3 words of Latvian. That's not very impressive, is it? And I'm very sorry that I do not have a mastery of your language. I do speak several others, but this is my first experience of visiting your country. Now, you have asked me to speak on a topic that is of immense interest around the world today. I find in many countries that professors and students and thinking people are extremely interested in the pronouncements of leading scientists on the God question. Now, of course, I am a pure mathematician. I shall be going outside my field of expertise by definition, but then everybody else does. And I think that we can control that to a certain extent by when we go outside our field, that we check with the experts in the other field and consider their best arguments and not their worst arguments. The God Delusion is the title of a best-selling book by Richard Dawkins. And in it, he expresses the hope that if this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. It is a book deliberately written to promote an atheistic, naturalistic worldview in the name of science. Stephen Hawking is probably the world's most famous living scientist. Until recently, he held the chair in Cambridge that Isaac Newton held. And I can remember him at Cambridge. He was a little bit ahead of me in time. He is light years ahead of me in his intellectual capacity as a theoretical physicist. But he too talks about God, and there's a recent book called The Grand Design that he co-authored with Leonard Mlodinow. And when it was published, there were headlines all around the world. Stephen Hawking says, there is no God. The universe is not created by God. Physics leaves no room for God. And that public confession by a man who'd kept his worldview fairly quiet for many years meant that the debate became activated once again. Hawking's not the only famous physicist. He has not yet won the Nobel Prize, although if Hawking radiation is proved to be true, he probably will, and deservedly so. Steven Weinberg has won the Nobel Prize. And Steven Weinberg said, the world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. Now notice he's not simply saying there is no God. He's saying that belief in God is a dangerous thing, and it is the task of scientists to get rid of it from our world. And to say that anything we can do, we should do, sounds to me very totalitarian indeed. Dawkins has recently teamed with astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss, and in their film The Unbelievers, they deliberately encourage the public to mock anyone who professes religious belief. So Weinberg says religion's a nightmare. Hawking says that religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. And the overall message is very clear. We have to choose between God on the one hand and science on the other. The underlining thesis is simply this, that somehow science and theology are at war with one another. There is no place for God in a scientific worldview, and there's no place for science in a God worldview. And I want to first say that as a pure mathematician, I'm interested in definition, of course. And we need to understand that by talking about God, we are not talking about the term in some vague sense, like the Greek gods or the Roman gods. I'm using Dawkins' definition, actually, when he says what he is against are supernatural gods, principally the God of the Bible. So when I use the term God, I'm thinking of the eternal creator and sustainer of the universe. Now, if there is one, then he's created the billions of galaxies. I love going out at night, occasionally on the 2 nights of the year in England when you can see the stars. I like going out and looking at Andromeda Galaxy. And to think of that with 100 billion stars or thereabouts, it's awesome. I'm thinking, when I use the word God, of the one who created all that, who thought it into existence, and who holds it in being. Now, the thesis of these people I have mentioned, and many others, is that God is a delusion. And I must first say that I enjoy the friendship of many of the world's leading atheists. They're not all as extreme as Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, and Steven Weinberg. In fact, today there is an increasing number of people in the scientific world who describe themselves as atheists, but do not like this extreme desire to remove religion. They will respect other people like myself. They disagree with me, but they respect me just as I respect them. So we must not imagine that everyone shares the same extreme view as Weinberg, Dawkins, or Hawking. But we need to mention them because of their profound influence. I was at a leading school in England just 2 weeks ago. Very bright students. And one of the teachers said to me, they come to our school at 13, and they are Dawkins supporters to a man. And they say to me, there is no point in giving us any instruction in theology, because science has shown that God is a delusion, that God does not exist. That's the age 13. And you can trace a lot of it in our country back to Richard Dawkins and others. Now, to claim that God is a delusion, we need to understand what we mean by the word delusion. And here again, I use Dawkins' definition. A fixed, persistent, false belief that is held in spite of strong evidence to the contrary. And then he adds, especially as a sign of psychiatric disorder, although he wisely chooses not to go down that line. So God is a delusion is simply a product of imagination, as Sigmund Freud said. And it leads to many people thinking that my faith in God is a bit like faith in Santa Claus. Do you have Santa Claus here? Yes. Or in the flying spaghetti monster. Now, it's interesting, I was debating in the Technical University of Delft in Holland a while back, and there was a physics professor. And he said, of course, God is a delusion. And Lennox, really, it's like belief in Santa Claus. And I thought that very, very amusing indeed, because I put it to the audience. I said, ladies and gentlemen, please tell me how many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as adults? Dead silence. Then I asked them, how many of you came to believe in God as adults? And there were about 1,000 people there, and several hundred put their hands up. And I turned to the physicists and I said, look, to put God and Santa Claus in the same intellectual category is foolish in the light of the world's intellectual history. Some of the best minds that there have ever been have spent centuries thinking of God, whether they believe in him or not. They have not spent centuries thinking about Santa Claus. So to put them in the same category is very unwise indeed. But there's a serious point, because our title, and if you translate it back into England, you'll find that many people stop there. Once the Freudian assertion is made that God is a delusion, that's the end of it. There's no need to discuss it anymore. But there is a great need to discuss it a lot more, because the Freudian argument simply does not work when you analyze it. In his best-selling book, Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, a brief history of the Great One of Germany's leading psychiatrists, Manfred Lutz, discusses this issue. And he said the idea that God is a delusion or a wish fulfillment, a projection of our desire for a comforting father figure in the sky, that works very well if God does not exist. But of course, if God does exist, the very same argument, the same Freudian argument, will show you that atheism is a comforting delusion, giving people the comfort that they do not have ever to meet God and give account to him for their evil behavior and desires. Czesław Miłosz, the great Nobel Prize winner for literature from Poland, said, atheism is the great opium of the people. So Lutz is saying, if there's no God, the God delusion argument works brilliantly. If there is a God, the atheism delusion argument works brilliantly. But as to the question of whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help you at all. That's Lutz's argument. Now, my reason for citing Lutz is this. When I read The God Delusion, I noticed Dawkins was not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist either. So what do? Well, I consulted the psychiatrists. I decided here is a claim in the name of psychology and science that God is a delusion. Is that what the experts in the fields of psychology and psychiatry actually think? And I'm very glad I did the research, because I discovered it's the exact opposite of what they think. Let's take one of the top professionals, the former president of the British Royal Academy of Psychiatry. And he writes this: the positive benefit of religious belief is the best kept secret of psychiatry today. If the research on this had gone in the opposite direction and led to the conclusion that belief in God was damaging, it would have been front page news on every paper in the world. And then he details the scientific meta-studies, that is, the studies of studies in epidemiological psychology. And he shows, by many quotations, the actual empirical evidence of the positive healing power of religious belief. Now, the interesting thing is, Dawkins is making a claim that God is a delusion, and yet he hasn't checked with the experts in the field. That is a very risky thing to do. And of course, it damages credibility. It's very amusing, actually, if you will forgive a personal reference. When Stephen Hawking made the remark I quoted earlier, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark, I was asked by one of our leading British newspapers, did I care to comment? And I did. And what I said was, Do you want a one-line reply? Oh, they said, yes, please, a one-line would be ideal. So I said, very good then. Atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, don't laugh, because it doesn't prove anything. Both statements are simply assertions, not based on any evidence whatsoever, actually, as I have just pointed out. So the interesting thing is that the title of a book that has massive cultural influence is based on what? A delusion. It's the Dawkins delusion, as my colleague Professor Alistair McGrath has pointed out in a book of the same title. You see, if we define delusion to be a persistent false belief in the face of strong contrary evidence, Dawkins' God delusion thesis qualifies to be itself exactly that, a delusion. Now let's go behind all of this, because it presupposes what many people now call the conflict myth, that you've got science here, theology here, and they're basically at war, and that we've got to choose between science and God. Religion, particularly Christianity, and science are at war. Well, that cannot be true. Why not? Well, let's stick with physics. Since you have many eminent physicists in this country, let's stick with physics. The Nobel Prize for Physics was won a year or two ago by Peter Higgs, the Higgs boson. Peter Higgs is an atheist. A few years before that, the very same Nobel Prize was won by William Phillips of the United States, who is a Christian. Now just think about what that means. Because what divides those two people is not their science. They're equally brilliant. They've gone as high as you can go. They've won the Nobel Prize. So what's the difference between them? Their worldview. Higgs an atheist, Phillips a Christian. And I'd like to submit to you that the first key observation in this whole cultural debate is to see it is not a simplistic God versus science issue at all. It's two worldviews in conflict. On the one hand, naturalism or materialism. On the other hand, theism. That's where the tension and the conflict lies. And the interesting thing is there are scientists on both sides. And once people see that, then the next question is clear. Because we can then ask, where does science fit in telling us about worldviews? Now, of course, science is a set of intellectual disciplines designed to study the natural world. Worldviews are our answers to the big questions. What is ultimate reality? Where does the universe come from? Where it's going from? To? Is there any meaning? And so on. Those are the big questions. And the tension point, in the Western Academy at least, is mainly between naturalism, which roughly says this universe is all that exists, and theism, which says this universe is not all that exists. There is a God who created it and sustains it. Where does science point? Is it neutral? Or does it, as Weinberg and Dawkins and so on claim, does it point towards atheism? Or does it point towards God? That, I think, is actually the real question that we need to ask. Now, we're talking about evidence and not proof. Proof, as a mathematician, has a rigorous sense, which only occurs in mathematics. It doesn't occur in physics, chemistry, or any of the other natural sciences. And then there's informal proof, evidence. What's your evidence for believing that? And that's the level at which I speak. But I need to point out that although we don't have mathematical proof, that doesn't mean that we don't have strong enough evidence to stake our lives on it. I've been married for 47 years. I can't prove to you mathematically that my wife loves me, but I'd stake my life on it. I couldn't prove to you mathematically that the ancient aircraft on which I flew to Riga this morning was going to get me here, but I staked my life on it. So when we speak about proof in the matter of evidence, we mustn't think we're talking about something that's essentially weak, because there's always a dynamic of uncertainty. And we must be humble, of course, in our understanding. So if I ask my question now in this different way and say, well, what is the evidence? Where would you get evidence from? Well, firstly, I would get it from the history of science. Secondly, from the philosophy and the nature of science. And thirdly, from the results of science. To try to answer the question, where does science point? Well, modern science, and I stress the word modern, grew in the 16th, 17th centuries under people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, and so on. They all believed in God. That fact is so striking that a lot of work has been done by historians of science like Alfred North Whitehead and many others, and they've come to the conclusion, roughly speaking, which was summarized by the late C.S. Lewis like this: men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. Now, this is fascinating in light of the current debate, because what it's claiming is that the theistic worldview was the motor that drove science. It didn't hinder science, it was the very motor that drove it. If I put that more sharply, I would say, I'm not ashamed or embarrassed at being a scientist. That is, if you allow a mathematician to be a scientist. Some people don't. But if you do, are kind enough to allow me to call myself one, I'm not embarrassed to be a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was Christianity that gave me my subject. Now here we can focus the problem. Newton and Hawking, both brilliant mathematical physicists, and yet Newton believed in God and Hawking doesn't, and they use the same reason: gravity. When Isaac Newton discovered the law of gravity, he wrote a famous book called Principia Mathematica, arguably the most famous book in the history of science. And in it he expressed the hope that it would convince thinking people that there was a God. Stephen Hawking says in The Grand Design, because there is a law of gravity, and I'm quoting, the universe can and will create itself from nothing, and therefore God is unnecessary and ultimately non-existent. And my question now, sharply put, is how do we move from Newton to Hawking? What has happened? And I want to suggest that what has happened is misunderstanding on two sides and not one. First of all, the misunderstanding of the nature of God. You see, I was careful to say that the God in whom I believe is not a kind of Greek god of lightning or thunder. But you see, such has been the pressure from the atheist side that the God of the Bible, the eternal creator, has now in many people's minds been reduced to one of the many gods in the ancient Near Eastern pantheon. Now, there is an immense problem with that from a historical point of view, because the experts like Werner Jaeger, who writes about this, says to say that means you don't understand the fundamental difference between the ancient gods and the God of the Bible was this: that they were all products of the basic stuff of the universe. In his words, they were descended from the heavens of the earth. All of these ancient philosophies had not simply cosmogonies, but theogonies, an explanation for the existence of the gods from primeval matter. That is, their gods were ultimately mass energy, material. And then Jaeger says, the God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. That's a vast difference. That's point number one. Point number two is that if you regard the God of the Bible like the God of lightning, say, then you are believing in what we now call a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. I'm sure you've all heard that kind of argument. If you're afraid of lightning, you postulate a God behind it, and then you come to the first lecture in atmospheric physics in the university in Riga, and that God disappears. And that is the common thinking among many people today. Now, the key argument that seems to me logically is this. If you believe that God is a God of the gaps, then you must choose between God and science. Why? Because that's the way you define God. See, unconsciously, what's happened in our culture is that I meet many people, and their concept of God demands they choose between God and science, because their definition of God is an unknown X who holds that space until a scientific explanation comes, and then he disappears. Hawking, I believe, is confused about the nature of God. I always read Einstein very carefully. And it was Einstein who said the scientist is a poor philosopher. And I need to remind myself of that all the time. And Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize, added to that in much more popular language. He said a scientist outside his field is just as dumb as the next guy. And we need to remember that when we approach these topics, especially me, who am giving a lecture on one at this very moment. So point number one is, on the God side, there's immense intellectual confusion. I call it intellectual fog, because of the definition of God that's forcing people to choose between science and God. But now, let's go to the science side. You see, Richard Dawkins says again and again that God is one explanation and science is another, and you choose between them. But that's completely false. Let's think about that for a moment. You see, if I say, why is the kettle boiling? Well, it's boiling because heat energy from the flame is being conducted through the copper of the kettle, and that's agitating the molecules of water, and that's why it's boiling. And somebody else says, no, that's not why it's boiling. It's boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now you notice something immediately. Those are two different kinds of explanation. You notice something else. The explanation in terms of a human agent, I want a cup of tea, is actually more important than the other explanation in the normal context of everyday life. People have been making cups of tea for thousands of years without knowing anything about what is actually happening. There are two kinds of explanation. That's why when Newton discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. No. He wrote the Principia Mathematica. Because Newton's understanding was, the more he understood of the universe, the more he could admire the genius of the God who'd done it that way. And that's the way it works. I expect you've got a wonderful museum of art here in Riga. The more you understand of art, the more you can admire Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls Royce, not the less. And the more you understand of the universe, the more you could admire the genius of God who did it, because you're not thinking of God as an alternative explanation to science. Let me put that another way. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for how a motor car works. No one in their right mind would think that you're setting up a conflict between Henry Ford and, say, automobile engineering and the law of internal combustion, because they're different kinds of explanation, but both are necessary. You can't give a full explanation of a motor car engine without both. Science explains. This is the problem. It lies actually in what we mean by explanation. Let's stay with the law of gravity. I was taught it at school. I found it so exciting. I later found it even more exciting when I could deduce the motions of the planets and teach students about them from that equation with 8 symbols in it. But you know, something was missing in my school teaching. I was told the law of gravity explains gravity. It doesn't, of course, does it? The law of gravity gives us a very powerful mathematical tool for making calculations. It doesn't tell us what gravity is, and Newton saw that. And Richard Feynman mentions it in his book. He said, don't let anybody kid you. These fundamental things like energy, gravity, and so on, we don't actually know what they are. And yet, when someone says, oh, science has explained that, we need to ask the question, at what level and to what extent? Because even within physics, a scientific law only gives a partial explanation at a certain level. And that is vastly important. Again, I emphasize that there are different kinds of explanation. Now, having that as background, let's see the difficulty that Hawking gets into with his central statement in the book, The Grand Design. And this is a central statement. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. I was given a preview of that, and I was so amazed at this statement and its logical structure that I wrote a book about it. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. But that's a flat contradiction. Because there is something, the universe creates itself from nothing. Contradiction number 1. Because there is a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists. But what would a law mean without something to describe? And that opens a window into a very profound misunderstanding. You'll see it with Paul Davies, you'll see it with Peter Atkins. The idea that laws can create something. I once was speaking to Peter Atkins, whose books I'm sure you all know on physical chemistry. And I said, Peter, what do you think created the universe? And without hesitation, he said mathematics. And I was so taken aback, I'm afraid I laughed. And he said, what are you laughing at? Well, I said, Peter, to be honest, I happen to be a mathematician. And that's about the silliest thing I've ever heard. He said, why? Well, I said, look, 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put $2 or pounds or euros in your pocket? There is a very deep, fundamental misunderstanding that laws can create something. In fact, I'm not an expert in economics, ladies and gentlemen, but you've all been aware of a financial crash, haven't you? Partly that was a result of some people thinking that you could create money by using mathematics. We call it creative accounting. But of course that's nonsense. And long ago in the 1940s, C.S. Lewis had written brilliantly about this. A law is of the form, if you've got A and B, then you get C. But you've got to get A and B first. You can do mathematics from now to infinity. But if you've not got €1 and €1, you'll never have two. Laws do not create. In fact, they don't cause anything. Newton's laws of motion have never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People accuse do that. The laws describe the motion, and they prescribe, they have a predictive value, but they don't cause it. So the law of gravity causes nothing. That's problem number 2. But the third one's even more problematic. In this one sentence of Hokings that's at the heart of his book. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, I've always been interested in logic. I nearly studied mathematical logic. The universe will create itself. If I say X creates Y, what does that mean? Well, roughly speaking, if you've got X, you'll get Y. If I say X creates X, what does that mean? If you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it seems to me to mean that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. This is amazing, ladies and gentlemen. This is supposed to be an argument against the existence of God in the name of gravity. And it's got 3 levels of profound contradiction, if indeed it rises to that level at its heart. That I find quite staggering. It's sad, really, because Hawking I admire immensely, not only for his mathematical brilliance, but for his fortitude. But you see, in that book on page 3, he says philosophy is dead. And scientists are now the torchbearers of truth. This is what we call scientism. Science is the only way to truth. But after saying philosophy is dead, which got him into a lot of trouble from the philosophers at Cambridge and elsewhere, he writes a book on the philosophy of science, because that's what the book's about. This is very strange to me. And unfortunately, the public, and here's the danger. There's a danger with me, it's a danger with everybody else. There's a danger in using your authority in one field to spread it out to another field and expect people to take you seriously on each area because you're a scientist. And one of the motivations for writing my little book was that a young man wrote to me and he said, if Stephen Hawking says there's no God, who am I to say there is? And that upset me so much that I decided to try and explain that even as a humble person without a lot of education, he could understand the arguments and he could see a way through them. Now, I'm going to stop in a moment or two, but there are a couple of questions that come up. One of them is that there is a great confusion also about the meaning of faith. Atheists have no faith, writes Dawkins. Even worse, Christopher Hitchens writes, our beliefs are not a belief, our faith is not a faith, whatever that means. And what that opens up is a problem that was highlighted when I debated Peter Singer, the world's most famous bioethicist. He's at Princeton, but I debated him in Australia in his home city. And I mentioned, as I often do to audiences so that they know where I'm coming from, that my parents were Christian and so were their parents. They did allow me to think, and they weren't sectarian. That made a very big difference. But Singer reacted and he said, there you are. He said, that's really shows what the weakness is, that people remain in the same faith in which they were brought up. So when I got a chance to reply, I said, Peter, I've told the audience openly about my background. What about yours? Were your parents atheists? Oh, yes, they were, he said. Oh, I said, so you remained in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, Peter, I'm very sorry. I was under the impression you believed it. Now, cyberspace went wild at that point, because here was one of the world's leading philosophers that didn't recognize that his atheism was a belief system. And often the argument that Dawkins uses is, atheism means not believing in God. That's not a belief system. But half a minute, the flip side of it is the vast reams of literature on naturalism and materialism that he himself contributes to. And we never get anywhere in the discussion unless we realize that all worldviews are belief systems. What has happened culturally in the English language, and it's a catastrophe, is that faith has been redefined as a religious word, which means believing where there is no evidence. It is no such thing, not even in English. Faith in English comes from the Latin fides, which means trust. And trust is only valid if there's a basis for it. But worse still, perhaps, from the scientific perspective, that redefinition of faith as blind faith obscures the fact that faith is central to science. It was Einstein, no less, who said, "I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith." Now, he didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. If you're going to do physics, you must believe that physics can be done. Otherwise, you never do it. So you're committed. You trust the human mind to do the physics to a certain extent. Otherwise, you'd never do it. So at the heart of all intellectual endeavor are faith commitments. That's the way it is. But to separate faith out and say it's religious and it's not involved in science is to make a profound mistake. And it's a very serious mistake. You see, I started with the question, is God a delusion? And we then investigated whether science and God are in competition. I'm going to suggest to you that science and atheism are in competition. That's a rather different thesis, isn't it? Let me illustrate it simply, because it could be a very lengthy argument, but it won't be, I promise you. I have many brilliant colleagues, and I often ask them what they do science with. And they say, oh, I say, you do it with your mind. Well, we're not sure about the mind, but we do it with our brain. I say, okay, fine. You do it with your brain. Tell me about the brain. Well, the brain is, it's the end product of a natural, unguided process. Oh, I say, that's interesting. And you trust it. Tell me, if you knew that your computer, or you believed your computer, was the end product of a natural, unguided process, would you trust it? Not for a moment. And when they argue with me, I say, do you know where that argument came from? Charles Darwin, surprisingly. It's known as Darwin's doubt. And he said, the horrible doubt sometimes arrests me, whether there's a problem with the reliability of the human mind, since it is, as I believe, descended from something more primitive. After all, he said, what could you say about the contents of a monkey's mind, if indeed there are any? Now, this argument, ladies and gentlemen, has become a major philosophical argument now. C.S. Lewis saw it in the 1940s. He said, we've done brilliant science with our minds, but we haven't studied the mind that's doing the science. And we've invented theories that invalidate human rationality, and they cannot be true. The most recent addition to the people using that argument is that one of the most famous atheist philosophers in the world, Thomas Nagel of New York. Nagel doesn't want there to be a God, so he's not biased in favor of God, but he says this. He says, if the mental can be reduced to the physical, we have a real problem, because it undermines any meaning that we can assign to thought. It doesn't only get rid of God, it gets rid of science and rationality and concepts of truth. That's a pretty big price to pay. So nowadays, I tend to give lectures not so much on has science destroyed God, but what are the dangers for atheism if you want to keep practicing science? You see, to go back to where we started, Newton and his colleagues had a basis in the Christian faith for believing that the universe could in part be understood by the human mind. Atheism threatens to remove that. Now, that does not mean that atheists can't do brilliant science. Of course they do, as I pointed out at the very beginning. But it means that there's a problem at the level of logical justification, a very deep problem that is now being explored more and more as the foundations of naturalism begin to reverberate with several major problems. Let me finally just say that this explanation matter has one more thing that needs to be said. I was taught when I was very young that explanation, to be valid, proceeds always from the simple to the complex. In other words, reductionism. And that is a very powerful tool, methodological reductionism. But that has led to a view of ontological reductionism. And that is that the whole universe can be reduced, mind, psychology, life can be reduced without residue to physics and chemistry. That's what Dawkins believes, and many others. It's interesting that, isn't it? Explanation from simple to complex works in many areas of life. There's one area it doesn't work, and that's wherever semiotics are involved, or language. The moment you see anything written, like your motto of the Academy with its lovely owl in the middle and its Latin text, the moment you see that, you immediately say that somewhere in the process of producing that, a mind has been involved. Why is that? Because you see language there, just a few letters written in Latin. Now here's a very interesting thing, that when it comes to words and semiotics, we have lived to discover the longest word in any language. It's called the human DNA code. The genome is 3.5 billion letters long, roughly, written in a 4-letter chemical alphabet. And the very same scientists that recognize the input of mind in a simple word in English or Latin or Latvian will tell me that the origin of the DNA code is solely in chance and necessity, chance and the laws of nature. That's a very curious deduction. How is it? Because DNA is semiotic. It carries information. It codes for the proteins. That's an area of life that interests me greatly as a mathematician, the question of the origin of information. So to conclude, is God a delusion? No. Not the God of the Bible, he's not a delusion. Many other gods are delusions, and science has successfully dealt with some of them. But God isn't a delusion. He's not in competition with science. In fact, I believe that science explains, but to quote Professor Swinburne of Oxford, the existence of God explains why science explains. He's not in competition. You need both sides of the story. So these worldviews, the one that starts with mass energy, or indeed nothing, and that's a huge topic. Getting a universe from nothing is a very difficult thing, but we might come to that in the question session. Starting from nothing, or mass energy, reaching up to life, to consciousness, to mind, and to the idea of God, because there isn't a God. But the other worldview, which I hold, is, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. Do you see the difference? The first worldview has mass energy, or nothing, as primary. Everything else, including mind, is derivative. The biblical worldview starts with mind, and mass energy is derivative. There couldn't be a greater polarization. And it's not only as a Christian, but as a scientist, that the second worldview makes infinitely more sense to me. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Professor Lennox, for this enlightening lecture. There's definitely lots of questions, and here is how we're going to organize that. So, first of all, I'll have an assistant, Andres Ozoliņš, with a microphone, and he has the power to give the microphone to you, and he has the power to remove the microphone to you. And remember, this is the questions and answers sessions. So, please make sure that your question actually contains a question. And we will take a number of questions, and John will take notes of them. So, and when there is enough of the topics raised that John feels comfortable to answer, he would answer multiple questions then in the order that he chooses. So we'll start with collecting questions, and when John gives the sign that that's enough.
You said I'd answer the questions I was comfortable with. I'll try the ones that I'm not comfortable with as well. Secondly, the point of doing this, ladies and gentlemen, is that in a room like this, there are many different ideas. And it's good for every one of us, including me, to have some idea of the spectrum of questions, rather than concentrate on the very first one. So if you have a question, keep it really short, so that other people can have a chance. And then when we've got a few of them, we'll have a look as best we can. So here's the first question. There, sir.
It is supposed that God should be an almighty being. This means that these powers are infinite. In physics, infinity always creates problems. For example, infinite density inside black holes. And I think that there are no infinities, physical infinities in nature. And that infinity is only an abstract mathematical idea. Would it mean that God also is an abstract idea, only abstract?
Thank you. Very next, provocative. Please. Number 2.
Vai kristīgajai teoloģijai ir kāda loma zinātnes rašanās un attīstības procesā?
Has Christian theology played any role in the development of scientific
thank you, yes.
Of science and scientific method? Thank you. Great. Some more, please.
Number 3.
I think just 2, right?
Oh, there'll be more. Don't worry. Yeah.
Okay, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Hello. I have a question about God. Is it a conscious or unconscious being? Well, for example, does it guide something from above? How do you think? Or it just makes something unconsciously and it doesn't guide?
Right. 4.
Okay. More questions, please.
Yeah, there's one down there.
Thank you for coming here. It's a great honor to see you here.
My pleasure.
And why people think that Christianity is the enemy of moral progress in the world? And,
are you thinking of anybody in particular?
No. And the second question about you are a lot of traveling now in the world and also in Europe. Your last stop was in Switzerland. And can you comment, did you see that many scientists are engaged in a faith, for example, in Christianity.
Sorry, engaged in what?
Engaged in a faith. For example, in Christianity, they are believing in some kind of God.
Okay.
And
so, like, you ask about faith and believe in God fueling violence and conflict.
Do you see Europe like a future for Europe?
Okay, fine. Jolly good, thank you. Number 5. Yes? Oh, now we're going. 5, 6, 7, 8. See, I have to wait long enough. Okay.
Mēs redzam, ka pasaule ir sašķelta milzīgi, ne tikai zinātnieku pasaule, bet ir daudzas reliģijas, un katrā reliģijā vēl ir viens pret otru. Psihologi un psihiatri saka, ka mēs no smadzeņu potenciālu savu varam izmantot tikai apmēram 4-5%.
Man ir jāiztulko. Man ir ļoti maz šeit, ja? The world is split so much. There is much disagreement and conflict, and also the faiths are split. They're all different. Then psychologists say, psihologi saka, ko?
Ja psihologi saka, ka mēs no savu smadzeņu potenciāli varam izmantot tikai apmēram 4-5%. Un ja mēs padomātu, kas notiktu, ja mēs varētu 100%, jeb kaut vai 50%, tad pilnīgi cita bildīt.
And psychologists say that you use just 4 or 5% of your brain, and if we imagine if we could use all of it,
and vai tieši šeit nav to pretrunu iemesls? Vai tieši šis nav tas pretrunu iemesls pasaulē? Paldies.
Yeah, and this underusage of brain, is that the reason for this division and splitting and inability to encompass everything?
Okay, the sixth one? Right.
Yeah, please, please.
Oh, look at this, wonderful. Hello, young man.
Vai ar to nepietiek, ka vēsturē Dievs ir parādījies un lai viņam ticētu?
Isn't it enough that the God has manifested himself in history to believe in him? Isn't that enough? I mean,
thank you very much.
Just a second. Yeah, just a second.
Just, I don't write too fast. Okay, thank you.
We've unleashed the collective intellectual power, I think, of the audience.
We got to 7. There's
Wow,
a man
really
there
questions.
waving desperately at the back.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. And I have a very technical idea and a question. How do you think maybe we live in a computer simulation, and God is some programmer at computer which just started the program which is our universe, and everything happens there according to his laws, how this program is made.
Okay.
So yeah.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay, now let's give this man a chance. We'll stop with you. He's had his hand up for a long time.
Man pavisam vienkāršs jautājums. Tas, ka jūs ticat Dievam, ir pilnīgi skaidrs, bet vai jūs pieļaujat ārpuszemes civilizāciju eksistenci?
Yeah, it's clear that you believe in God, but do you?
Oh, thank you. I'm glad it is.
do you believe in the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations? Do you allow? Would you admit the possibility that they exist? Is there an option for them to exist since you believe in God?
I've got
right?
the question.
Good,
yes.
excellent.
Fine.
Okay, I'll save these two for the next session.
Thank you very much for these questions.
There'll be more. Don't worry. Think of them through, and let's let John respond.
Right, we've got 8 questions so far. Thank you very much, and they're all very interesting. Now, a Q&A is by definition unsatisfactory. Why? Because I've just heard these questions, and all I can do is give you an instant reaction. But that's inadequate, but that's a good thing. Because if you've asked the question, far more important than anything I say will be your research on the question when you leave this place. If you're seriously interested in it, you'll do the work. So remember that. I can only give, most of these would take a lecture if I were competent to do it. But you're now about to discover my ignorance. So off we go. The first question was about infinity. And I was very interested in how you put it, sir, because I'm one of these people who are also, like you, skeptical of real infinities. There's a famous argument called the Kalam cosmological argument, which says you can have infinities in mathematics, but you cannot have real infinities. I think the problem is when it comes to God, the word infinity doesn't occur, for instance, in the Bible anywhere. And we need to ask, as your question implies, what does it exactly mean anyway? When we, the usual argument, is God so powerful, he can create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? And I think that C.S. Lewis's comment is better than anybody's, that nonsense remains nonsense, even if you talk it about God. And I think your question contains a warning, a very good warning, that we need to be very careful before we bring mathematics and its concepts into theology, and also some Greek philosophical concepts about infinity that aren't actually part of the biblical revelation. I don't think the conclusion is that God is only abstract. I wouldn't know what that meant. What I would say about it, and this is an assertion, is that what we're dealing with here is the nature of ultimate reality. Now, what I find with my atheist friends, and myself is that we both have a concept of ultimate reality. Atheism goes back to either mass energy or now to nothing, full stop. That's ultimate reality. For me, ultimate reality is God. And if I ask the question, how do I get to know God? You see, the Christian claim is much bigger than simply saying, look at the universe, there's evidence of intelligence, of plan, of design. It says a lot more. It's specific historically and experimentally because it claims that God has revealed himself in space-time in a person, so that God is a person who can intersect with space-time physically. Now, can I understand that? No. But neither can I understand light or gravity or energy. So I'm not surprised to find things in the Christian faith that I cannot understand. For instance, we are enjoying light at this moment, even though we don't understand it. And there's lots of things in life that are exactly like that. We don't understand them at every level, but we can enjoy them. So the idea of God being abstract, it doesn't actually make sense to me. And the fact that Christ claims, whether we believe it or not, but what Christ claims is that he is God incarnate, gives you a much more concrete intersection with space and time. Now that's just very brief. I'm sorry, but it'll have to stay there. What about Christian thinking contributing to science? That's an important question. I was once at a meeting, not long ago actually, of some of the world's leading physicists and theologians and philosophers. And I made a comment on the Bible, and they stopped me and they said, look, come on. You cannot seriously suggest that the Bible has any relevance to contemporary science. And I made a couple of points. Point number one was this. Well, I said, look, of course the Bible is pre-scientific. By definition, historically, pre-modern scientific. Secondly, it doesn't deal with the questions that science deals with normally. Thirdly, in the Bible we find the mandate for doing science. On page 3 of the Bible, God, we are told, instructed humans to name the animals. That's taxonomy. It's the fundamental intellectual discipline. So the mandate for doing science is actually there. God didn't say, I'm going to do it for you. You do it. And a lot of us make a living out of it. So it's a very positive mandate for science. But now thirdly and specifically, on the one hand, I say the Bible's not a textbook of science. I do not teach algebra from the book of Leviticus. I just don't. And nobody ever has. But on the other hand, there are biblical statements about the same universe that science describes. The statement, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is a statement about the physical universe. And it says explicitly there was a beginning. Now, we're happy with that today because of the standard model of physics. But I'm old, you see. I remember the 1960s, not the 1860s. I remember the 1960s when the scientific evidence started becoming very strong for the existence of a beginning to space-time, particularly in the work of Arno Penzias and the microwave background. In England, the idea that there was a beginning was resisted by the very top people in the Academy of Sciences. The editor of Nature, the most famous scientific periodical in the world, wrote at the time, we must not go down this route of accepting the fact that there was a beginning. Why? It will give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible. That's so interesting now, looking back, because here was one of the biggest advances in physics in the 20th century being resisted because the advance seemed to converge with what the Bible had been saying for centuries. And at this meeting, I said to them, I said, look, if you had taken the world view of Scripture more seriously before you did, and not relied on Aristotle's view of an eternal universe, you might just have looked for evidence for a beginning scientifically before you did. So you can make a prediction on the basis of Scripture. But I think my final answer to your question is that this explosion of science in the 15th, 16th centuries is worth thinking through in detail. A lot has been written about it. Firstly, they themselves claim, Kepler, Newton, and so on, that their motivation was because there is a God who is rational, an intelligent being, we would expect to be able to do science. So the biblical contribution was not to do the science, but to provide a background atmosphere culturally on the basis of which science could be done. But there's a second element there, and that's the element of contingency. The idea that this universe could be otherwise, and the only way to find out what it's like is to go and study it. And that is partially to do, according to a colleague of mine who was at Oxford, Peter Harrison, he has developed a very interesting thesis that it wasn't only the belief in an intelligent creator that was behind the rise of science, but it was partly the reformers' work in theology in shifting away from allegorical interpretations of the biblical text to moving towards, let's see what the text says and not assume what it's got to say. And that may be another major contribution. So it seems to me that they are there. Now, the next question was, why do people think that Christianity is the enemy of moral progress? And you had a second question. We shouldn't really allow second questions, but I will. Many scientists engage in this debate? Well, the first question is a huge question. And the irony of it is, I became so concerned with your question that actually I've put my thinking into a book called Gunning for God, which deals with moral objections to Christianity. But in it, I analysed Dawkins' argument in the God Delusion, who says nobody gets their morality from the Bible. And then he lists his new 10 commandments. Every one of them can be found in the Bible, which I found very, very strange indeed, except the ones he's added at the end of the 10, an extra 4, which you will not find in the Bible. But this question of the moral argument is a huge thing, and we'd need another lecture for it. I haven't dealt with it. I've made a few suggestions on the scientific side, but I'm very conscious that a lot of people react against Christianity, not because of the science, but because of the morality. And if I just say that I come from Northern Ireland, you perhaps understand that I've got something to say about that as well. But since you didn't ask, I'll say nothing. Now, related to your question, yes. Isn't it enough that God has manifested himself in history to believe? It's a very interesting way of putting your question. I find it really interesting. You see, it is possible that you have understood a lot more of what lies behind my lecture than many people do. Because what I've been arguing is, I believe there's evidence scientifically that there is an intelligent God behind the universe. But that's as far as you get with the science, you see. And I would come down along your side and say, but that isn't the only side. The much more important side is not our thinking about God looking at the stars and the mathematical description of the universe. It's God's personal revelation to us in Jesus Christ. And your question was, isn't it enough for us to believe? Of course it is. And many people who haven't a notion about science and are undisturbed by it, bless them, they believe in God because they've discovered Christianity works in their real life, in their everyday life. And of course, if that were not the case, I wouldn't be a Christian. Because contrary to what many scientists say, Christianity is testable. I might just say something about that in a moment, but that's as far as I'll go with that. This. Now, there was a question about the world is split. There are many religions, and psychologists say we only use about 4 or 5% of our minds. I suspect I only use about 0.5% of my mind. And I'm very aware of this. The question is, are these divisions simply the result of minimalized intellectual activity? I don't think so. I wish we could use our minds more, and sometimes in the geniuses of this world, whether they're artists, musicians, scientists, writers, we get an insight into what the human mind can do. We can't all do that. But you see, this business about God is a personal thing. It's not just a question of some kind of equation or reacting to the universe scientifically. From where I stand, I speak as a Christian. Other religions must, of course, speak for and defend themselves. But as a Christian, there is a moral issue which you hinted at. And that is, I may see some evidence of God, but I may not want any real relationship with God. And so the splitting up into different belief systems, some of them highly esoteric, some of them historically based, others this, that, and the other, is not only an issue of intellectual capacity, and that if we were only brighter, as Socrates suggested, that we would sort all of this out. No, I don't think that is the case. I think other issues play a role. But what I would say is, within our limitations, and I have many limitations, I only know of one way of proceeding and making these decisions, and that is saying, what is the evidence? I want to know why I commit myself to something. And that's why I've actually spent my entire life exposing my faith in God and Christ to question. Why? Because I actually want to know. So I'm a very skeptical person. Skepticism, skeptine in Greek, means to check out at a distance. And I spend a lot of my time checking things out at a distance. Now, do we live in a computer simulation? You should read Paul Davies on that. The physicist, he writes a lot about that. And if so, how would we know? And with many of these things, we don't know actually what it would mean for we to live in a simulation. There are 3 terms that are virtually undefined there. And would we be we? Would we be human? Or what would we be? Certainly in computer simulations, you can create little worlds that are programmed deterministically. But are they alive? I suspect they're not. These are very difficult questions. But there again, I think the evidence goes that to use our common sense is not a bad thing. And I would rather commit myself to the evidence of a lifetime's investigation of these things in common sense, history, experience, than to base my life on a speculation. And what would be the consequences? Suppose you were to say, well, we just live in a computer simulation. Well, so what? We don't even know what it means. We can guess, so we can get no further. It's a kind of unproductive idea. ET's related to it. Do I believe in extraterrestrial intelligence? Of course I do. God, for instance. And I mean that quite seriously. God is not limited to space-time. God is spirit. And, of course, this is now biblical stuff. But I do see that the Bible does hint from time to time that this is not the only world there is. So the idea of there being extraterrestrial intelligence, well, we know very little. God hasn't told us everything. I think behind the question is not do you believe there is, but what are the implications? I haven't a notion because I don't know any of the evidence about it. So that's an easy question not to answer. Now let's see. Is God conscious or unconscious? Of course he's conscious. Every analogy we know, except radical materialistic philosophy, tells us that our source is unlikely to be less than ourselves. We are conscious human beings. Our source, our origin, the one who created us, is a conscious being. But what puts that beyond question for me is the nature of Christ himself. That is, if you take his claim seriously. He claimed to be God in human form. Now, you may or may not believe that, but the important thing is to see exactly what Christianity claims before you reject it. And the claim is that Christ is God in human form. Now, can I explain that to you? No, I can't explain energy to you, as I pointed out. But I believe it to be true because that description is the only one that makes sense of the evidence as I see it. And that brings me back to your question, and we're going to finish with your question, I think. How's the time going, sir?
Fine.
We've got a bit more time, have we? Oh, you've got, give me those a minute, and we'll leave it. Are those written questions?
Yeah, these are written questions. So
in Latvian?
In Latvian, but I'll definitely give them. But
yes, read them out.
Yeah, and there are actually a number of, but one question per paper, and including those which you haven't answered. Is God a scientific concept? Can you approach God scientifically? Like, in a sense, it's related to is theology, is science, and to what extent?
Okay.
The other one is why particularly the Bible? Why particularly how to make the choice of the particular religion? How about Allah, okay, Muhammad, Buddha?
Okay.
And if I can throw the third one from myself, it's also related to what's written here. I do physics for a living, and I do physics for a living.
Good for you. Yes, very good. Okay.
Right. And you mentioned this concept of relying on the intelligibility of the universe. For me, it's definitely not a precondition to the physics. It's just to collect beautiful seashells, collect beautiful pieces of evidence that match together so well that keeps fascinating me and drives me along. But I definitely do not trust neither my own mind, neither the grand question of that everything should be intelligible. And now, physics has never ever failed me. Whenever I go and test theories which have been proven by evidence before, new evidence keeps confirming my faith. And then I go along that line and see that physical pieces of evidence, something I definitely trust, I can trust, as far as I can test. And then this is confronted with the biblical story, which obviously, the text which obviously contradict, the key pieces of the Christian message obviously contradict the extension of my faith in physics.
Like what?
Like turning water into wine, all the miracles of the New Testament, reincarnation, things which I cannot connect physically to the world, to the physical worldview that I've been developing as part of my profession. What's your response to that tension?
Oh,
so that would be the third tension, the third question. Yeah, and probably before I think we'll finish with your answers, I'll just make a technical announcement. First of all, there is coffee outside, and there will be space for discussion till around 6 o'clock, which is still a lot of time. Well, half an hour. And also tomorrow we'll have the pleasure to hear John again at 6 o'clock at the main building of the University of Latvia. Everyone is welcome in the Grand Aula, and his discussion partner will be Professor Marcis Auziņš tomorrow at 6 p.m. So, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Is God a scientific concept? The use of the word scientific there is the problematic one. You see, what we're dealing with in the culture, I think, several levels of confusion. One, that science is the only way to truth. Then the second one that's related to it is that scientific is equivalent to rational. Now, it's very important to realize that rational and scientific are not the same, especially if we're speaking of the methodology of the natural sciences. If that were the case, you'd have to shut half the faculties in your university. History, literature, all the rest of them that aren't the natural sciences. And that's where I think the concept, the difficulty with this question comes. Is God a scientific concept? What you mean, like energy and this kind of stuff, Not so much that, but he's a rational concept. God is a rational being. Let me put it another way. If you ask the question, is John Lenoksa a scientific concept? You'll see what the difficulties are in the formulation of the question. Because it's really a non-question. That's not what you mean. What you really mean, I think, is he a rational concept? And I hope he is. But it is important to distinguish between science and rationality. And one of the difficulties we're in is many people unconsciously have assumed that scientific and rational coexist. Now, the next question is yours, sir. And that's about 6 questions. But I suppose you're allowed that as the moderator. And you say to me, you don't rely on the intelligibility of the universe. For me, you collect evidence. But just a minute, you're collecting evidence for something. You're testing some theory that you have hypothesized. That is, you set it up and you say, now, how would we show that that's true? And then you test it. That's what I mean. If you didn't believe that might lead to a real conclusion, you'd never do it. That's all I mean by that basic assumption. So we're not contradicting. I liked your metaphor too of the pebbles on the shore and so on, and that physics has never failed you. It's testable, and therefore it has confirmed your faith. And that's exactly what I would say myself, that these things we test and it confirms our faith in the methodology and in the results. And though there's a different level, as you know, not every student has repeated every experiment in the physics textbook. They have to believe what you say. So you become a trusted authority without them doing that. So there are different levels of the exercise of trust. But then you raise a very important question. You say you come across things in the Bible that are scientifically impossible. And many people do. And they say to me after a lecture like this, oh, this sounds very good. There's evidence for God in the mathematical description of the universe. But look, you're a Christian. And you appear to be obliged to believe things that are absurd. Jesus turning water into wine, rising from the dead, and all this kind of thing. So we need to face that. Now that normally goes back with many of my colleagues to David Hume. It was David Hume, the 16th century Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, who suggested that miracles are impossible, essentially, because, I quote, they are violations of the laws of nature. And now that we know the laws of nature, it was okay in the time of the New Testament when people didn't know any science, they didn't know the laws of nature, they could believe in miracles. Hume was completely wrong on both of those counts. And shortly before he died, I managed to get an interview with Professor Anthony Flew, the world's greatest authority on David Hume, who was a very strong atheist for most of his life until, in high old age, he considered the implications of DNA and came to believe in an intelligent God. But leave that aside, let's go to Hume. This idea of miracles are violations of the laws of nature. If I believed that, I would agree with you, but I don't believe it. Let me try and illustrate it to you very briefly, because this is a very, very important issue, and I'm so glad you raised it, because people will go out and say, but he didn't mention this. And this is often the problematic point for many people. Firstly, the idea that people living in New Testament times were primitive in the sense that they didn't know the laws of nature is completely false. Completely false. For instance, Joseph, the husband of Mary, knew exactly where babies came from. That hasn't changed for centuries. And so when he discovered his wife was pregnant, he didn't believe her story about angels and visitations and God, and he wanted to divorce her. Why was that? Because he was ignorant of the laws of nature? Of course not. It took an awful lot of evidence, which is a story for another time, to convince him otherwise. The early Christian preaching centered around the physical anastasis, rising again of Jesus from the dead. They wouldn't have regarded it as anything special if people had been jumping up out of the graves all over the place. They knew exactly what we know, that dead people normally stay dead. That's why they made such a fuss about it. This idea that they didn't know the laws of nature is simply false, and you can illustrate it. There's a huge discussion of it in John's Gospel, where a blind man who'd been born blind gets cured by Jesus. And the religious authorities say, well, he's not the man, and then say, well, this, and this. And he said, look, this man, who was presumably uneducated, he said to the religious authorities, look, since the beginning of the world, it's never been known. Here's the law, that a blind man gets his sight back. Something remarkable has happened to me. So that's the first point, where Hume was wrong. But the second point, are miracles violations of the laws of nature? Of course not. I'm staying in a hotel in Latvia tonight, in Riga. Imagine I put 100 euros in my drawer tonight. And then tomorrow night I put another 100 euros. So by the law of arithmetic, I've got 200 euros. I wake up on Sunday morning and I find 50 euros in my drawer. So what has happened? Have the laws of arithmetic been broken, or the laws of Latvia? Here's the problem. It lies in the concept of law. You see, when we think of a law of nature, we tend to think of a law of a country. But the laws of Latvia are prohibitions. Now, let's think of the analogy. It's due to C.S. Lewis, and I find it very helpful indeed. How do I know that the laws of Latvia have been broken? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been. You see, if I imagined the laws of arithmetic could be broken, I'd say, well, 1 + 1 = 2 yesterday, but today, obviously, it only is 0.5. That would be nonsense. It's because the laws of arithmetic haven't been broken. But now notice, the real problem is, I believe that the drawer with the euros in it was a closed system. It turned out not to be. Somebody put their hand in from outside. That hand didn't break the laws of nature. It broke the laws of Latvia. You see, let me put it another way. If I as a Christian were claiming that Christ rose from the dead by some natural things going on in the grave 5 minutes before it happened, then you could argue that the laws of nature were being broken. But I don't claim that at all. The biblical claim is that God raised him from the dead. It was an input of power from outside a system that's not closed. And the big issue that lies behind this whole question is this universe, let's extrapolate up, is it a closed system of cause and effect, or is it not? I don't believe it is. So the problem, in fact, dissolves completely when we see the difference between the two kinds of law. Now, the problem doesn't quite dissolve because we're not going to be gullible and believe every claim. You mentioned reincarnation, which actually isn't in the Bible anywhere. And there are all kinds of other things. We've got to test the evidence, which is why I was so interested in your question, you see, that actually I decided to have a look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus through the eyes of David Hume. And in the last couple of chapters of my book, Gunning for God, that's exactly what I've done. Because Hume had talked about miracle, but he also talked about criteria for evidence. Who should we believe and on what grounds? And I found those very compelling to do an analysis of this. So the first question to be answered is, are supernatural things in principle possible if there is a God? If you answer that positively, then the second question is there strong enough evidence to show that one has happened or more? So you have to take those two things, first philosophically and then separately. And the final question, before I collapse, is why particularly the Christian religion? Now, that's a perceptive question, because it's obvious that most of my lecture would apply to the three monotheistic religions that believe in the creator of the Bible. But you perceive that I'm a Christian. Why is one a Christian? Now, that's a personal question, and it's quite sensitive. And let me explain why it's sensitive. The moment one begins to discuss differences between religion publicly, the danger is that if you start making a criticism, it's taken as a devaluation of people's moral standards. I mentioned my parents. We lived in a divided community where there was violence on the Protestant side and violence on the Catholic side. You probably know all about it because our land is sadly infamous for it. My parents so believed that each man and woman was made in the image of God that my father employed equally across that divide. We were bombed for it. My brother nearly lost his life as a result of the bomb. The place was set on fire several times. But that's because he believed what Genesis said about all men and women, whatever they believed. Now, I will never answer this question unless I can tell the audience that's exactly what I believe. I saw it lived in my parents. I have friends in all religions and none. I believe about all of them. And I hope I show it in the way I respect them, that they're all made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. They may not believe in God, but that's what I believe about them. Now, once you've got that clear, we can talk. And then you can talk easily with representatives of any religion or none about the differences. It's mostly my atheist friends get a bit nervous about talking about differences. And let me put it very quickly to bring it to a conclusion, although this is a huge question. Let's look at the evidential side. I have many Jewish friends. They believe that Jesus died but did not rise. I have many Muslim friends. They believe that Jesus didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. Those three are mutually contradictory. How do you decide? I know only one way, on the basis of evidence. And we have to make up our own minds on the basis of evidence. And if people come to different conclusions, we must accept that. This is a free society in that sense. God doesn't browbeat us at all. That's point number one. Point number two is this. And I'm going to word this very carefully, ladies and gentlemen, because we're running out of time, but it's very important. People look at the differences around the place. But as far as I can see, and I may be limited, Christ doesn't compete with any other religion or philosophy at all. Why? Because he offers me something none of the others offer me. That's a huge statement, isn't it? Christianity, you see, is testable, which is part of my answer to you. Christ claims that if someone trusts him and repents and trusts him as Lord and Savior who died for them and rose again, things happen to them. One, they receive peace with God. They receive forgiveness. The guilt problem gets dealt with. They receive new life and new power to live. And here I am now in my 8th decade. I've seen that happen hundreds of times. And when you see marriages rescued, you see people recovering from drug addiction or narcotic addiction, you see people with meaning come into their lives, and they tell you themselves that what happened is that they became a Christian, they trusted Christ. Then the evidence mounts up, it's testable. And you see, this question of knowing forgiveness here on earth, as far as I can see, I may be wrong, is not offered anywhere else. Christ does not compete with anyone else. So it's no shame to take from him what no one offers. But that's a huge question for another time. I think I'd better stop there. Thank you so much for your questions and your attention.